Well, thank you very much for joining this Secretary Speaker Series event. I'm Wade Crowfoot, and I serve as our Natural Resources Secretary. And these events are an opportunity to bring in big thinkers, smart folks from outside of our agency, outside of state government, to talk about key priorities or issues of the day. So today we're going to spend the next hour plus with three really interesting leaders on the topic of drought. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes setting the stage for us, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. This has obviously been a remarkable summer. Exploding record-breaking temperatures across the state, very concerning wildfire conditions, and now worsening drought, our second major drought in just a decade. I've been working on climate change like so many of you for the last couple of decades, and have experienced these impacts, which scientists suggested could develop by the end of this century, actually come to California and parts of the world today, decades before they were predicted. This acceleration of climate change and its impacts is cause for major concern, and also a moment when we have to step back and understand truly what we need to do, first to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and lead the world in transitioning our economy to low and no carbon, but then also to protect our people and natural places from these natural phenomenon that are becoming more threatening as a result of climate change. Just last Friday, Governor Newsom was in conversation with climate scientists and announced that he's asked our California Air Resources Board and our California Public Utilities Commission to consider how to accelerate key targets that we have to achieve carbon neutrality and emission-free energy, respectively. This is born out of a recognition, I think, that the governor shares with so many of us, that while we can be proud of California's climate leadership in recent years and decades, the science suggests that we have to move even more quickly. Again, both on the climate mitigation side, reducing carbon pollution, and on the climate resilience side, protecting our communities and nature from the impacts of climate change. So today we're going to unpack one manifestation of worsening climate change, and that is the drought we're now experiencing. We're going to first hear from our drought guru in state government, Janine Jones, who serves as the Interstate Resources Manager at the Department of Water Resources. Janine has been a key leader in drought management in state government for a very long time, and brings the long view and just a ton of expertise around managing through drought in California. We're going to then hear from Noah Diffenbaugh, who is a professor and senior fellow at Stanford University and a climate scientist. He's been a lead author of papers from the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, the scientific authority on climate change. And then lastly, we're going to hear from one of the biggest and most visionary thinkers on California water, and that is, of course, Ellen Hannick, who leads the Water Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. And then we'll bring all these three leaders into a conversation and integrate your questions. As you have questions that you'd like to ask, please click on the bottom of your screen on that Q&A icon and type in your questions as the presentations occur. And hopefully we'll get to just a whole lot of conversations from participants. We have several hundred participants joining us today from our agency, across state government, and then, of course, stakeholders of every form. So thanks again for tuning in. Janine, I'm going to turn to you first, if you could. Give us some situational awareness of this current drought. I understand that we're in a second dry year, but for those who might not be tracking this like you on a daily basis, if you could talk about this drought, what we're experiencing, and really how this has differed from the last drought that many of us navigated through in 2012 to 2016.
All right. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. So as we know, we are now in a drought emergency in much of the state, covering 50 of California's counties. This is a second dry year for much of California. Last year, water year 2020, was very dry, especially in Northern California, although parts of Southern California were roughly average or even a little bit of above average precipitation. But all of the state is dry this year, and that has resulted in now 3 emergency proclamations covering California. A number of counties have adopted local proclamations, and the USDA drought disaster designations, which are intended to provide rapid assistance to agricultural producers, now cover all of California's counties. Next slide, please. So drought is not a stranger in California. It's a normal part of our climate system. In the black here shown on this slide are our most hydrologically severe droughts, but pointing out these are droughts as defined by consecutive dry years. Actually, within our historical record, the period of the 1920s, 1930s overall was our driest longer term period. But fast forward to this century, and this century we have been in drought or dry years more often than not. First, we had our 3-year event in 07-09, then the 5-year event, and now we are embarking on yet another dry journey. Next slide, please. So our last drought, which was not at all long ago, was different from some of our others in that we had our driest and second driest ever years in terms of statewide temperatures, which resulted in setting a new record low for statewide snowpack, only 5% of average in a record going back to 1950, and some new impacts that we were seeing that were a change condition from our historical record. One was a massive explosion of wildfires, which has actually been continuing, for some time now, and also some other temperature-related impacts, such as harmful alpha blooms in our lakes and reservoirs. Just last year, for example, California not only set a new record for the number of acres burned in wildfires, we greatly surpassed the last record. And if you're wondering, that picture there on the slide, that's not the Golden Gate Bridge, that is the Bidwell Bar Ridge over our Lake Oroville, with a fire in the background, which resulted in a precautionary evacuation of our large power plant at Lake Oroville. So, definitely not things that we saw in our earlier droughts. And in fact, in our last drought, we had to take response actions that hadn't been necessary since 1976-77, including, for example, curtailment of water rights on the state's largest and most used rivers, the Sacramento and San Joaquin systems. We also saw first ever zero allocations for the Central Valley Project agricultural contractors throughout the valley, which created or facilitated some additional impacts in terms of relating to dry private wells in some area, and triggering a first ever state emergency response for some of these clusters of dry private wells in areas like Tulare County, where old shallow wells that had previously been adequate were no longer adequate as a result of these changed conditions. Next slide, please. So where are we this water year? Well, California is certainly a red state this year. Much of the state has had half or less of average annual precipitation, not to mention the very warm temperatures on top of that. And in fact, it's worthwhile noting that essentially the entire Colorado River Basin is dry this year. And we have been in essentially a long-term drought in the Colorado River Basin since 2000, keeping in mind that the Colorado is a very important supply for Southern California. And with the 3 major statewide droughts that we've experienced within California this century, this is starting to look very familiar to us. Next slide, please. And now to point out that however you like to slice the data, we have been experiencing very warm temperatures in this century. This is just a snapshot of the current calendar year to date, where we rank as 123rd out of 127 years of record, with 127 being the driest year of record, which was back, the warmest year of record, sorry, which was back in our last drought. So clearly these warm conditions are with us and they're causing new impacts for us to think about. Next slide, please. So, we have learned lessons from our past drought, and we've built upon California's already, wonderful network of water infrastructure that gives us so much opportunity to respond to droughts through tools like water transfers and exchanges. But in 2014, we adopted the statewide groundwater management legislation, or SGMA. We identified new funding sources, particularly for small water systems, which have historically been the most at risk during past droughts. We're implementing lessons learned about needs throughout the state from programs like our integrated water management portfolio. And we're looking at the whole suite of actions that the state needs to adopt to improve resilience just in the long term, because we need to move away from the construct that drought is just an emergency that happens every once in a while. We do a little bit of water conservation, we're good, we don't have to worry about it. We're really seeing a shift towards a different climate, long-term warming, and we have to take actions to adapt to this, including things like improving our forecasting of runoff, which is so important for managing state, federal, and local water projects throughout the state, because as we saw just earlier this spring, the runoff that was expected based on historical hydrology didn't happen, which means that we need to improve the forecast, take advantage of longer lead times so that we can take actions to plan things like response programs for dry private wells, dealing with fish and wildlife problems, and of course thinking about, as we go into the summer wildfire season, all the work that the wildfire agencies will need to do. And next slide, please. And just to point out in this last slide here, we have recently spun up a drought website for California, which provides information about current conditions and the response actions that the state is now taking. And we encourage everyone to turn to this website for a quick check-in on what the state has been up to. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janine. And just a note to everyone tuning in today, that drought.ca.gov will be updated in real time and is really meant to be the informational resource on how state government is helping to navigate us through the drought. And Janine and I, you and I worked together during the Brown administration, of course, managing through the last drought. And I think we were all hoping for successive wet years after that last drought to really give us some time and space to implement sustainable groundwater management and SGMA to allow our natural environment and our fish and wildlife to recover. But remarkably, we had, in essence, one very wet year in the middle of two droughts. And as I have learned, that some scientists are even considering this sort of one successive dry period with a punctuated wet year. I want to just emphasize a couple of learning lessons from the last drought that I think really do color the way that we're navigating this drought. First is, I should say, the appreciation for just how different drought challenges are across the state. I think, I'll speak for myself. In the last drought, I thought about our challenges across the state as sort of one set of challenges. And we're realizing that depending on water sources and where you're located in the state, what watersheds you're in, really different impacts. And so one thing we've taken into this drought is a more of an appreciation of those regional differences and an attempt to really tailor our support as a state to the water agencies in those different regions. Sometimes we talk about California's water system, but I really view this as a system of systems. And so we're really asking ourselves where we can provide support to the different systems in the state. And then the other key point is our portfolio approach, which can be described as an all of the above approach. We certainly need more water recycling, more stormwater capture, more water conservation, more underground storage, and in places where it makes sense, smart surface storage, certainly much more investment in environmental habitat, ensuring enough flows in our rivers. So this portfolio approach really manifested in a playbook that we're using in the Newsom administration called the California Water Resilience Portfolio, which you can find on drought.ca.gov or across our different agency websites. So thanks, Janine. As I mentioned, Janine is really one of our gurus on drought and supports the Drought Resilience Task Force that the governor put together that's been meeting together for several months to navigate through this period of the drought. Next, I'm going to turn to Noah Diffenbaugh. And again, Noah serves as a professor and senior fellow at Stanford University and is one of California's preeminent climate scientists and has been a lead author on IPCC papers on climate change. Noah, the question I want to ask you is really about the connection between drought and climate change. You know, Janine showed us a chart that demonstrates that droughts are part of California's hydrological cycle. So just what has changed as a result of global climate change, and how should we be understanding its impact on the current drought and on future droughts?
Thank you, Secretary. So that's something I've spent quite a bit of time working on in recent years, including during the last drought. And there were a number of different scientists and research groups around the country and the world trying to understand the last drought. And a few things we learned that I think are relevant for what we're experiencing now. One is that absolutely, California's climate is dry and variable. And one of the big discoveries we made during the last drought was that when we looked back at all of those drought episodes that Janine showed, all of the droughts in California's history occurred with low precipitation. Being somewhat tongue-in-cheek, this is that was pretty obvious confirmation. But there was something really critical about those low precipitation episodes that turned into severe drought. And that was high temperature. So when we look back at California's history, it absolutely takes low precipitation to produce drought, but a low precipitation year is about twice as likely to turn into severe drought if conditions are also warm. And one of the ways I talk about this is if we just think about flipping two coins, and California's temperature and precipitation historically really have been like flipping two coins. So if you think about getting heads half the time and tails half the time on the precipitation coin, and likewise on the temperature coin, earlier in California's history, we'd get low precipitation, high temperature together about 25% of the time, and that was really elevated drought risk. And what's happened as a result of the long-term warming of California is we're now in a climate where essentially all the years are warm. When our paper was published back in 2015, it was 80% of the previous 2 decades have been warm. We're now 5-6 years on from that, and we're essentially in compared to the 20th century baseline, we're essentially in a warm or hot year after year. So what that means is that when we get low precipitation, conditions are pretty much guaranteed to be in place of that warm temperature condition that amplifies drought risk. Why does it amplify drought risk? Pretty intuitive reasons. When the atmosphere is warm, draws moisture out of the soils. It draws moisture out of vegetation. Critically, we heard from Janine about snowpack and runoff from snowpack. We know that when conditions are warm, the snow that falls melts a lot earlier in the year. We've also seen in research from the last couple of years, the storms that bring precipitation to California are getting warmer. Those atmospheric river storms are warming. The elevation of the rain snow line is going up. So now when we do get precipitation, it's more likely to produce runoff when it happens. And the snow that does fall is more likely to melt earlier in the year. And I think what Janine described about this year was really apt for understanding the role of warming in drought risk. We did have snowpack April 1st this year. We did not get much runoff from that snowpack into reservoirs, and in particular, we had the most rapid warming, melting of snowpack, in memory. And by the time we were in June, we were, it was if we hadn't had the snowpack at all, essentially. Like 2015, and reservoir levels were already at, extremely low levels. So, I'll close by saying, getting back to what the Secretary was saying about sort of how rapidly these changes are emerging. There was a cover article in Discover magazine in 1988. So I was in middle school, and it featured work from Peter Glick, laying out just almost exactly what I just described in terms of the warming and the snow hydrology, elevated flood risk in the winter, and protracted warm, dry conditions in the summer. And those maps had, kind of present day and 2050 as this new snow hydrology. And I'll just say, Peter Glick was spot on, and from those predictions from the 1980s. And as the Secretary said, we're living with those now. And it's a different climate than what our infrastructure and water management systems and our legal frameworks, those were all designed and built and implemented in a climate that is not the climate we have now. And it's a climate where these kinds of severe warm, dry conditions punctuated by wet conditions are much more likely than they used to be. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Noah. A couple follow-up questions briefly. One, just wanted to make sure, can we conclude, given that, flip of the coin, one coin is always hot, does that mean these severe droughts will be more common or more frequent? I think that's my first question. And then secondly, a lot of us are obviously focusing on wildfire too. And if you could talk about a little bit the connection between, a warming spring, summer, winter temperatures and drought and wildfire.
Yeah, so on the first question, when our paper from several years ago now, during the last drought, when we looked at those historical percentages, in our calculation, the drought risk had doubled. And that was, what we weren't sure about was whether we were sort of in 100% risk condition. And we actually did some projections in that paper out, we saw that out around, 2040 or so, that we were predicting that the temperature condition would be kind of permanently in a high risk condition. And a question I have right now is whether we're seeing that even sooner, whether we're, have we already moved into a climate where if we get low precipitation, we're guaranteed to have severe drought? I think that's an open question, but we're certainly in elevated risk. And the wildfire is another area where we've had a lot of research in recent years, and we've all felt the impacts, of course, so acutely. Something that's become clear from recent research is that the warming of California has really been concentrated in the late summer and early autumn. So we've had warming at the annual scale, we've had warming in all 12 months, but the 3 months that have had the most rapid warming have been August, September, and October. And that aligns with what really elevates wildfire risk, not only having those hot summer episodes that we've experienced, but then having those warm conditions extend into the autumn, because the autumn is when we get, as part of our normal climate, those strong offshore winds. And in our research, what we found is that the frequency of extreme wildfire weather has doubled over the last 4 decades as a result of this, this warming of the late summer and autumn, as well as some what's emerging in the literature of a signal of a decrease in autumn precipitation. So if we add the snow, what's happening with the snow in the winter and spring, the warming overall, and these changes in the late summer and autumn, that's really producing very dry vegetation conditions much more frequently, which we know is contributing substantially to the increase in area burned that we're experiencing in the state and more broadly in the region across the West.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's just important to draw a connection between the triple whammy of drought, extreme heat, and wildfires. And so much of our response can be a little sectoral in government, but we're increasingly trying to connect and identify what multi-benefit actions we can take to ameliorate the drought impacts, but also address wildfire risk. Thanks so much, Noah. And again, Noah's a professor and a senior fellow at Stanford University, climate scientist. I next want to turn to Ellen Hannick. And Ellen, of course, leads PPIC's Water Center and puts out remarkably clear and insightful scholarship on California water, both the challenges we face, but also the opportunities we have to become more drought resilient. And Ellen, one of the reasons I asked you to join us is you're always very frank around what you're seeing and what you recommend that we do. And part of the benefit of the speaker series is to bring folks that really are a step outside of government to really talk about the current drought and the future from their perspective. So I just want to first ask you for your, kind of broad perceptions of this drought, how it's evolving versus the last drought. And then as you're sharing with us, move into, what are the implications of this? Obviously very sobering, the details Janine shared, and then the climate science and the trajectory that Noah shared. Help us understand what should we be thinking about in terms of shifting our water infrastructure or water management to become more resilient in this new climate normal?
Easy. Thank you. So first, thanks very much for the invitation to join you, Secretary. And it's an honor to be part of the platform. I think what I'll start with is I share your view that it would have been really nice to have, 5 or 10 years of mostly wet, cool weather after the last drought. We barely got a breather and a little bit of chance to recharge groundwater basins, but and to fill reservoirs sort of, but not nearly enough. So folks are all back in the thick of it right away. Maybe there's a silver lining here, which is Janine pointed out that in the last drought, the state had to take actions that it hadn't taken since the late 70s, and that meant that there weren't a lot of folks with fresh memories of really grappling with a major drought. This time, that's not true. This time, definitely, people have their playbooks still, on their desks, and they've been able to pull them out and refresh them. And I think, there's been there were definitely some learnings, both on the part of the state, but also on the part of folks at the local level, in terms of thinking about, okay, each drought gives you a chance to get better for the next one. And we looked at this kind of from a sectoral standpoint to see, okay, where are the big vulnerabilities and how does one improve? And last time, California cities and suburbs were not in bad shape, partly because they had made a lot of investments, both in long-term demand management and in building their resilience on the supply side. But we saw additional efforts last time, and they've come into this drought with lower water use per capita. That never fully rebounded. So that's been a boon coming into this drought. And places like the Sacramento region made investments to really interconnect the different water utilities, that some of whom were vulnerable because they were really dependent on Folsom. That's in place now. So those kinds of investments are going to kind of continue, and I'm sure we're going to see more of that with this drought. What in the city suburb world you have to really worry about, especially, are the places that are kind of don't have easy connections to each other. So some of the Central Coast areas, tend to be the most vulnerable, and that's where I'd recommend the state to really look to how to really help there. The other group that didn't do that badly last drought because they had some tools available, even though they depend a lot on water, is agriculture. California has the biggest agricultural sector in the nation. We have a great place to grow things precisely because you can add the water. You've got the sun, you've got the soil, and if you can be precise with where you're putting the water, it's magic. But it means there are millions of acres that need irrigation. And during the last drought, what farmers did when they got big cutbacks in surface water was They did some trading. They took some land out of production, but they also pumped groundwater quite a bit. And groundwater is a great drought reserve, but you can overuse that reserve. And I think that's really what kind of pushed toward the adoption of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in the last drought. It was 100 years in the making, really, compared to when we got our modern surface water code in place. And folks have been, I work a lot in this space. Folks have been hard at work at implementing, in the early stages of implementing SIGMA, as it's known to folks who work on it. But we're really in early days of implementation. So I think with the seriousness of this drought is saying, people were kind of hoping for some breathing room. SIGMA allows 20 years to get to sustainability, but you also have to avoid very significant impacts in the meantime, like causing folks' wells to go dry, drinking water wells especially, land sinking, subsidence, those kinds of things, impacts to ecosystems. And so it feels like we're going to have to amp up and get that going sooner. And maybe a boon of our current budget situation at the state level is that there is some funding to help with some earlier transitions and pilots to get people to really be thinking about, are there places where, yes, we've got to get as much water into the ground for recharge, but also are there places where maybe some of that land should be coming out of production and being used in some other beneficial ways? The third sector that was really vulnerable last time was small communities, drinking water in small communities. And that was where we saw wells going dry, small community systems going dry, or on the verge of it. And the state stepped in with emergency help, but we were kind of catch-up mode because there was just not a lot of data around where are these wells and so on. And so folks sometimes went 6 months without having water delivered to their homes. I think we're in a better position now, at least to kind of not have those gaps in time. But there's been work, and this has been partly state-led, but also with counties and with local stakeholder groups, environmental justice groups, working on really getting better drought resilience plans for these small communities, so that folks don't run the risk of not having drinking water. And this is an area where I think there's still a lot of progress to be made, but we're in a better shape to do that now, thanks to some of the work that's been done over the last 5 years. And then finally, the really hard one is ecosystems. And Secretary, you pointed it out, and Noah and Janine as well. This is a tough spot we're in with our freshwater ecosystems. The heat makes it worse. Just the lack of water makes it worse. The harmful algal blooms make it worse. All of those things together, and it's a place where you get into some of the tough trade-offs, especially with some of the big water using sectors. So we're hearing the heated voices talking about just the fights and the trade-offs there. And I guess my thought is that on that one, I don't think there's easy solutions, but I think we can get better at anticipating and building our risk management tools so that agriculture and cities can do more to kind of manage carryover water, to sort of store for droughts, get more water into the ground, to have that ready for droughts, be able to trade more, and maybe move toward providing the environment with some of its own storage and a seat at the table in a way that kind of can work more flexibly. And I know that there have been conversations around this that have been going on for a while. So that's sort of a space that we've been thinking would be, maybe we get to a better place after this drought.
Ellen, that's really helpful. I just want to note that we have upwards of 400 people joining us today. Thanks for your participation. And if you want to ask a question, please just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question, and we'll start to move into a little bit of an interactive dialogue here. So question, just want to follow up though with you, Ellen, first. And Reggie asks a question about water rights. My colleague Joaquin Esquivel, who leads the State Water Board, has talked about California having 19th century laws and 20th century infrastructure to face 21st century challenges with climate change. And so water rights might fall into that category of at least starting in the 19th century law. And so some folks feel like water rights are sort of a fundamental challenge that needs to be addressed. Can you talk about, again, as an independent thinker on this, how you think about water rights and the interaction of water rights and drought management?
Thanks. And it's a good question, and it's a really important issue and a tough issue. In the last drought, we pulled together a team of some really eminent legal scholars on this issue, including Brian Gray and Buzz Thompson and others. And this team, excuse me, this team concluded that we didn't need to blow up the system. We just need to kind of get our arms around it a little bit better. So, you know, because it is a longstanding water rights system. Be major challenges in just aiming to overhaul it completely, but having a better handle on where the diversions are, what the rights are around it, sort of basically a better data system, so that the state is in a position to react more nimbly to saying, okay, this is a river or a stream system where we're going to have to make calls on this and cut back water use and have that be legally defensible. It's something that protects other water users as well as the environment, and we're not quite there yet as a state. You combine that with the ability for people to flexibly trade and store water, and it's possible to manage the hydrologic risk better.
That's really helpful. So James, let's bring in the Brady Bunch view, as I call it, for a really question for everybody. And that is, how the heck do we manage moving forward given the rapid change in climate? I referenced the acceleration of climate impacts. And I recall that in one of the past climate assessments where the state actually funds research to have scientists like NOAA downscale the global climate impacts to understand how this will change California. Some of those studies predicted impacts for the end of this century that we're already experiencing. So question for you, maybe starting with Janine, is, DWR has this water plan, state water plan, and it's identified as being sort of a forward look at managing hydrology moving forward. Seems like last century we built a remarkable infrastructure to capture some variable hydrology, but over time, more or less the same hydrology. How do we even model or anticipate the changing hydrology, the changing temperatures that will help us inform how we navigate through future droughts?
Well, and I'll follow up with, a topic that Ellen had touched on. Her specific reference was to the data issue, but there's certainly a lot that we can do to improve our data and forecasting that will buy us some time. One of the examples I like to use is that if we go back, say, to the 2007-2009 drought and earlier droughts, we identified three major challenges in terms of data and information and state response gaps. One of them was not knowing what was going on with state groundwater levels. Well, courtesy of first the CASGEM legislation in 2009, then followed by SGMA, we are so much better off now than we were then. Another issue was just the lack of awareness and tools to deal with small water systems. Again, particularly after our last drought, the enactment of the SAFER funding program, the work that was done on the identifying drought vulnerabilities and risks of small water systems, which is a report that we in the State Water Board just published. A lot of recognition and progress on that issue. One that we really haven't done is improving the forecasting tools. And we saw that very clearly this spring with snowpack. But another thing we know about drought is that we really need the longer lead times to put into place some of these complex tools. And one area where it was even flagged in the 1976-77 drought was improving longer range precipitation forecasting, knowing at the beginning of the water year, what's the water year going to be like. And that would be such a huge benefit. But, frankly, as water agencies or as state government, that's not really our wheelhouse. And we have to bring in our federal partners and get them more engaged and get the research community engaged in this, because just imagine how much more nimble we could be in response if we had just these kinds of better information tools.
Yeah, fair point. And you mentioned this new or this updated website, drought.ca.gov, which is really an informational source for state government. For those watching today, another great resource is the US Drought Monitor. And every week it actually publishes an update of the drought with a graphical presentation. And that's a real remarkable federal partnership. And we're thankful to the agencies. Noah, you're part of the non-governmental science community. How how far are we toward anticipating what hydrology will look like and what climate change interaction with our water system will look like in the next 10 or 20 years? How would you recommend that we approach managing water given the accelerated change?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge for the reasons that have been stated from a yeah, and I think one of the sources of the challenge is that we're moving into uncharted territory in terms of conditions we're experiencing relative to our past observations and our past experience. And so as climate change continues, it's presenting conditions that we haven't observed before. And we've talked about some of them already today, and just in terms of what's happened this year with the snowmelt and the runoff. So as scientists, we're working hard to try to keep up. And I can assure you that even, as with the last drought, the number of studies that were published during the last drought, I can assure you that's already underway right now, trying to understand the novel conditions. I think there are some, both some limitations and some lessons that we can act on now. In terms of limitations for predictability, absolutely having more investment in research on seasonal and multi-seasonal predictability. So let's say, 3 to 12 months nominally. It would be great to have more investment in that science. And there are some real limits in the actual world, right? So we can't, we can't out predict the limits of the real chaotic system, would be one jargony way to put it. And so on the timescales that would be really useful, the world doesn't always comply in terms of being predictable. So that's some of the challenge. Some of what we can learn, I think, is one of the real lessons of the last few years is that our systems are not built for the kind of co-occurring events and conditions that we're experiencing in recent years. And I think this gets back to your question, Secretary, about the climate projections and how we integrate climate projections into decision making. There's a tendency both in the scientific community and then I'll say when I get asked by stakeholders to sort of look in a spatially confined way at what the projections are. And even if the projections, if we stipulated they were reliable, if we look at them in a vacuum spatially, I think that's really where we're getting hit on some of these events, is that we can look in this part of California or that part of California or this part of the West or that part of the West and calculate probabilities. But where we're really getting stressed is when these conditions are co-occurring. And I think that's something we haven't addressed enough in the research community, is quantifying how not just the conditions are changing through time, but what that means for spatial co-occurrence and how that overlays onto our response, preparation and response systems.
Yeah, well, it's obviously complex. Let me put in a request for you as a member of the scientific community and your colleagues to just help us understand, at least even in ranges or bands, what we might expect. But my takeaway is expect the unexpected. And something I talk about a lot is taking a system that was centralized, fairly rigid and static, and making our water systems more decentralized, more flexible and more dynamic, recognizing that it seems like the weather extremes are getting more severe. Ellen, a bunch of questions coming in on desal, and we hear about this a lot during the drought. 1,100 miles of coastline. Is desalinating ocean water an answer? Can it drought-proof California? If so, how? If not, why not?
So desal is an important tool in places where it's straightforward to do it. Desal is expensive. It's, you know, it's the most expensive, one of the most expensive options we have for augmenting water supplies. So it's, for example, it costs so much money that you would not want to use it for agriculture, because it would be costing more than the money that you would be making by selling those crops that you'd be irrigating with it. In a place like San Diego, where it's important in the portfolio, I think it's like 8% of the total regional supply. That is worth it to that region because it improves their resilience, but they wouldn't want 100% desal. So we have to think about it in that context as something that can help, but it kind of goes back, Secretary, to what you were saying about all of the above. You have to think about a portfolio and what those options are, and desal is maybe a small piece of it. I think recycled water is going to be a bigger piece of the urban portfolio going forward, just because you have to treat that water anyway to a certain standard for clean water purposes. So it's not at the margin. It can often be worth it to go in that direction and make it even cleaner.
Thank you. The flip side of drought is, of course, flood. And we got a great question from Camiar, one of Janine's colleagues, around, you know, while we're fixated on drought right now, we obviously always have flood in the back of our mind, given its threat on communities and nature. How do we actually utilize these extremely wet winters to actually address drought moving forward? Are there big ideas? Are there efforts underway?
I'm happy to jump in on that quickly. Maybe one of the things that we do see since the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed is a tremendous interest in increasing the ability to capture floodwaters and get them in the ground. And you know, you see beginnings of that already in the Central Valley happening, as well as elsewhere. And Camiar's team has been doing some great work looking at this idea of FloodMAR, you know, flood managed aquifer recharge, and the multiple benefits you can get there. I think the missing pieces of it are making sure that we have an easy way to get approvals to take and get that water in the ground. And there's been some progress made on that in the State Water Board, but we need to go further on that. And then the other piece, Secretary, and this is where I'd say I agree that decentralization is, you know, regional approaches are important, but we have to also use our statewide infrastructure better. And this is where thinking about making sure we use that infrastructure and build it up where we need to reinforce it, to be able to get floodwaters to the right places when it's available, is going to be an important piece of our infrastructure going forward.
I'll add one comment in terms of what we can expect from a climate perspective. And this is an area where we have very clear understanding that, you know, we can expect acceleration of what we've been experiencing. So one of the PhD students that I advised had a dissertation chapter that was published last year where she analyzed the flood response following precipitation events on the basis of how much rain versus snow they produced. And as you might expect, when there's more rain produced, there's more runoff after that event. But what was really key in her findings was that it's not a linear response. It's actually, you know, you can imagine more of a exponential response. So as we experience greater warming and a larger fraction of precipitation being delivered as rain, we can expect not just a linear increase in runoff from those events, but actually an exponential increase. And you know, how we adapt to that, you know, I defer. But I do think from a climate perspective, this is something where the physics are quite straightforward in terms of the melting of water, and we can expect not just further intensification, but further acceleration.
That's helpful. And given this more intense rainfall versus snow as the temperature warms, Janine, talk a little bit about our efforts to modernize management of our reservoirs. Our Army Corps of Engineers manages reservoirs for flood control to protect downriver communities, but reservoirs also provide supply. So can you talk about this whole using forecasts to better manage reservoirs?
Yes, so something that has been an outgrowth of our work with research partners on atmospheric rivers has been the concept of using forecast-informed reservoir operations to take advantage of the fact that, as opposed to when reservoirs were initially constructed, much of our major water storage infrastructure is mid-20th century-ish, with a lot of the hydrology that went into that even older. Well, at the time, the Army Corps of Engineers didn't place much faith in weather forecasting capabilities because, for heaven's sakes, the first weather satellite wasn't launched until the 1960s. So we have a lot of improved capabilities at the short-term weather forecasting timescale that can be used to buy at least maybe a week's worth of look ahead into inflows coming into reservoirs. And we need to work on the institutional side with partners such as the Army Corps of Engineers to be able to take advantage of that from a regulatory standpoint, so that if, for example, if it's the middle of winter and you don't expect any more inflow coming into your reservoir, can you relax that flood reservation in the level of the reservoir and gain some more storage capability to help you over what may be a very dry summer? Currently, there are 3 FIRO pilot projects in California now, and that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity to move forward with all of our flood control weather reservoirs and see if we can, wring some additional benefit out of those in the near term.
Yeah, thank you. To me, that what we call FIRO in the state, forecast informed reservoir operations, has such potential to simply better utilize infrastructure that's already there for water supply benefit in a way that continues to protect against flood risk. So to me, there's actually myriad of those types of solutions that we're putting into place. And to Janine, your point, every drought cycle, it seems like this work accelerates to shore up that resilience. There are a bunch of questions coming in on dams, and don't we need more dams or reservoirs? And I'll take a crack at answering this, which is certainly storage is important, particularly as we move into more extreme weather and wetter years. I'll say that underground storage can't be overemphasized. In other words, 50 times the amount of storage exists in our underground aquifers than the entire amount of our surface storage system. So we have available storage. The big question, as we've just talked about, is how do we get those floodwaters to recharge groundwater basins? So that, to me, is something most people agree on, and we're focused on facilitating that more quickly. A lot of the dams and reservoirs we created in California that form our system bisected rivers, and they were built before we truly understood the impact on migrating fish. And so from my perspective, it's very unlikely that those types of reservoirs are a big part of California's future. That being said, entities in Southern California have made great use of regional surface storage. So smaller, nimbly placed surface storage that builds the resilience of regions to weather droughts. Likewise, an off-stream storage project that has gained state funding and is currently working through the process is Sites Reservoir. And a lot of questions need to be answered to ensure that that off-stream reservoir that doesn't bisect the Sacramento River, but would draw from the Sacramento River, could actually be operated to the benefit of water users, but also protect fish species that rely on the Sacramento. So I think surface and groundwater, it's an and, not an or, but increasingly, from my perspective, really ensuring that we're maximizing groundwater storage, underground storage is going to be really helpful. Ellen, question to you. We get a lot of questions during the drought about agriculture and certain crops that are being grown that are high water intensive but low value. Likewise, some questions coming in about the increase in the amount of trees that are planted, which require water year in, year out that can't be followed. How do you navigate this question of sort of what's the future of agriculture in California, given this more variable water cycle and the probability of greater, more frequent droughts?
Thanks. I get that question a lot too, and it's one of those tough issues because in a drought, you sort of look at the ag landscape and you think, oh gosh, we got to do something, right? How do we cut it back? And folks that are not in agriculture have a tendency sometimes to think maybe we should regulate what crops should be grown. And one of my missions when I talk about this is to say this agriculture is a business, and folks that are planting these crops are making that calculation based on all the input costs, on their estimates of what the product market is going to look like, and so on. And it's really it's very, very tough to second guess those decisions in terms of what they should be putting in the ground. Where policy can be really important is making sure that folks are using the water that they have the right to, and not somebody else's water, and kind of have a sustainable framework for that, and making sure that folks have access to tools to manage their hydrologic risk. So this is where the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is really important, because that is going to be setting a framework so that folks are not just going to be depleting the aquifers. We're not there yet. It's in process. So that's a place where we have progress to make. I think that this drought is going to be a bellwether in terms of really leading to some hard questions within agriculture about the share of perennials versus annuals in places that are facing really big surface water risks. And you're seeing stories about this in the news of growers taking out not just old trees, but trees that are, well before their expiration date, just because they realize that they don't have enough water to be able to water them year in, year out. And I think we're going to see that in parts of the San Joaquin Valley in particular, with maybe a shift back toward more annuals. I also think we are going to see some reduction in total acreage farmed in California over time. Not so much that it makes us no longer an important ag state. We are still going to be an ag leader, but there's probably 10% that is too much on average overall.
Thanks, Ellen. I want to interject with a basic question that's come in, which is, some comment around, boy, this is a little daunting. Somebody put it as terrifying. What can regular Californians do? Without individual action, there may be a sense of helplessness and just sort of watching this evolve. Governor Newsom last week called for 15% water reduction, reduced water conservation across the state. Janine, you're at if you're interacting with people that don't know water policy, that aren't positioned to be consequential in this debate or conversation in Sacramento, what can regular Californians, everyday Californians do?
Well, certainly there's the whole suite of actions that people can take in terms of conservation, from the obvious practices like not using a hose to clean your sidewalk when you can use a broom, and things to thinking about the water use for your landscape. But I think it's also important to educate Californians, to point out that we are moving to these times of warmer conditions and probably more scarcity of resources. What should we be doing as a society to think about this, and encouraging people to think about the big picture on resilience, not just this, it's a drought, well, I have to conserve water for a few months and then I'm over and done with, but working with their water agencies and with their local officials to say, what does my region really need, and being willing to support, more water recycling, for example, as part of a portfolio approach, or more thoughts about how local land use is being planned and managed, and thoughts about supporting new activities, because we know in some areas, communities may express a lot of resistance to things that they may feel are just increasing their water rates or their utility rates without seeing a benefit from that. And I think we really have to do a better job of talking about the benefits of long-term resiliency going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just note that Californians reduced their water usage well over 20% during the last drought, and about 16% of that water conservation stuck. And a lot of the conservation that we can do if we live in places where we're, irrigating our yards is to change out our landscapes. My family was lucky enough to move into a home recently in Sacramento with decomposed granite for its yard. And while that's not for everybody, it's worked really well and requires no water. I'll say something maybe a little controversial, which is we brought over this conception of a green lawn culturally from a place in Europe, England, where it has it's pretty wet most of the year. And so, identifying beautiful and sort of shifting our landscape yards to beautiful landscapes that really work with our Mediterranean climate, I think is a really good opportunity. And even for people who live in apartments, I mean, we all use dozens of gallons of water per day, and that adds up. So small behavioral changes that you can make. We have a website called what is it? Is it, Janine, saveourwater.ca.gov?
It's Save Our Water, yes.
Yeah, saveourwater.ca.gov, which is really focused on helping people identify what they can do in their own lives. I want to move from that question, which is pretty direct, to a much broader question. And there's a good question coming in from Gary about polarization. When drought happens, we see more conflict covered in the media, so-called fish versus farms, or urban versus rural, or sometimes north versus south. And Ellen and Noah, just with your perspective as outsiders to state government and folks who don't live in Sacramento and engage in these conflicts on a weekly basis, how do we try to transcend that polarization, recognizing that we are one California and we need to meet all of these needs to the best of our ability?
So the first thing is maybe don't yield to clickbait. And what I mean by that, I'm getting a little feedback. I don't know. What I mean by that is, the voices that are going to say the things, or the sound bites that are the kind of most extreme, are the ones that you're often going to see elevated in the news, because that's part of the business of the news. But there are a lot of folks really trying to work in partnership, I think, in a lot of different watersheds on how to tackle this. And this is where Wade, the Secretary Crowfoot, I mentioned early on in my remarks about things like voluntary agreements where you're getting folks, different water users together, senior water rights holders with more junior ones, with folks in the regulatory agencies to really think about how do we manage our changing conditions for the benefit of the economy and people and the environment. It's hard work. Doesn't happen overnight, but it's not as sexy as the sort of inflammatory sound bites, but it's the space where we have to work, and I applaud folks who do that.
Thanks so much. Noah.
Yeah, Secretary, you gave a personal story, a little bit about your landscaping. So I guess I'll answer this with a little bit with personal. I'm a lifelong Californian. I was on the faculty at Purdue University in Indiana for 5 years. Otherwise, I've lived in California my whole life. I come from farming family on my dad's side, family that's farmed going back generations. I keep a bag of almonds in my drawer in my office. I consume almond milk, and the list goes on, right? I mean, I really value as a Californian, the amazing biodiversity, the diverse ecosystems that we have, the dynamic, vibrant economy that we have, the tremendous agricultural sector that we have, and the diverse citizenry that we have. And I think that this, what we're talking about in terms of climate change and drought and water really gets the intersection of all of those. And I'll just say as a scientist, the challenge in thinking through the changes that are happening and what's likely to happen in the future really is the challenge is really at how these intersect. And if the argument is, well, if we just eliminated this one, then there'd be enough for everything else. Well, that's as a scientist, that we don't really consider those scenarios, because we're not going to just get rid of a sector. So I think in terms of climate change, in terms of adaptation and resilience, the fact that we have all of these tremendous resources here in California, and we're having this discussion, trying to figure out how to provide for all of them, that really gets to the heart of climate change adaptation. We're in a different climate, and how we thrive going forward is really the challenge.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to respond to this question around polarization, but before that, I want to give you guys a due warning that I'm going to ask you to answer questions in a final speed round, and that is, what sort of low-hanging or no regrets fruit do you think we should pick regarding building our drought resilience? And then, if you had a magic wand, or where you're the benign dictator, what would you change or have us resolve in California? So sort of a short-term, no regrets, and then a big, broad, fundamental change. And on polarization, from my perspective, well, if I was here in person, you'd see that my hair is rapidly becoming gray or white. And I think a lot of this is because we have this severe challenge where, on the one hand, we cannot allow, our iconic fish, our salmon, to become extinct. These are fish that have returned to California's rivers for 10,000 years, that are the cultural lifeblood of tribal communities, support commercial fishing industries, and are part of our heritage as Californians. Likewise, we can't allow for the economic collapse of communities in the Central Valley. The per capita income in the Central Valley is among the lowest in the United States. Agriculture is the lifeblood of the Central Valley. Water is the lifeblood of agriculture. And likewise, in our cities, we need to continue to grow and provide more equitable opportunity. So, we need to meet these needs as best we can: environmental, community, economic, and we have to find a way to move forward and build our resilience on each of these fronts. And so I appreciate, Ellen and Noah, your response. We're going to continue to do that, and it's a very tough balance in years of severe water shortage. But from my perspective, where we can find collaboration, where we can find investments that actually meet multiple needs at once, that's one promising way we move forward. So let me then move to the speed round here. Recognize we have about 5 minutes. Ellen, recommendations for state government, federal government on the line, local water agencies. What should we be doing near term, and then big fundamental change?
Near term, just keep making it easier to get water in the ground, and make it easier for folks to manage their risk through trading and through carryover storage. Long term, or big, I don't want to say long term, heavier lift, but I hope not too long term. Let's turn the environment into a partner at the table when it comes to managing the water. So instead of a regulatory constraint, kind of setting aside a water budget for the environmental water and including in our storage reservoirs.
Thanks so much. Great suggestions. Noah.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about the groundwater recharge using stormwater. It really, as our hydrology changes, having solutions that help both improve our flood risk management and our water storage, I think are critical. And groundwater recharge is, has been shown to be the most cost-effective of what's on the horizon. And then the bigger lift, as Ellen said, for me, economic inequality, equity, environmental justice, I think are critical. We certainly saw the really intense distributional impacts in the last drought. I hope it's not the same in this drought, but I think for all the reasons that have been said, that's a big concern and will require more than just addressing water resources.
Yeah, thanks. And I think there's a greater acknowledgement than ever of the disproportionate burdens on communities in some communities in California and their vulnerability, not only drought, but to other climate impacts. So thank you for lifting that up. Janine.
Near term, I think we have to go all in on improving forecasting, all time scales, all methodologies, things like FIRO or precipitation, snowmelt runoff, whatever, because these are relatively cheap compared to many of the other alternatives that we have, not politically controversial, can be done quickly. Longer term, we need to go all in on investments in groundwater recharge and storage, because that would really help everyone.
Thanks so much. James, big thank you to helping us manage the IT. I wonder if you could bring up the slide with the website that was just updated and launched for everybody to be able to see. And big thanks to our colleague Lizzie for organizing. This has been a great conversation, wide-ranging. As usual, we got dozens of questions in, only some of which we could explain. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Janine, for your candor and all that you're doing to build our drought resilience. For those of you who have tuned in, know that we're holding other Secretary Speaker series later this summer, including a focus on extreme heat. So we look forward to your returning and participating in the conversation. Should you want to learn about these upcoming events, you can do so by clicking on the website on our screen here. Thanks once again. Stay safe and have a great week. Take care.